first, you have written about this issue of India and strategic bombers. You've offered a pretty comprehensive view of what these could be used for, why India doesn't have them. But you also argue that there may come a time that there could be a situation where India might need strategic heavy bombers of the kind that we see in the United States and elsewhere. Why do you say that, sir, and what do you think?
Firstly, Shiv, thank you for having me here. And you know that only 3 countries in the world have got bombers as of today. These are USA, Russia, and China. They are the 3 most powerful militaries. India is the 4th largest military, and therefore this debate that should we have a bomber or not. Remember that we have had bombers, so has UK, France, and of course in Second World War, Germans had bombers. So there are countries who have had bombers, but they left them. So to understand whether India needs or not and when should we have, I think there are 2 areas which we must look at first. What are the advantages of a bomber and what are the disadvantages? The first big advantage for a bomber is a large aircraft. It will have long range. It can, it can carry much larger number of weapons nowadays. Cruise missiles. There are some bombers which are even supersonic. There are bombers which are stealth. There is more power source on a bomber. You know that power source has become very important now because direct energy weapons, lasers, they all will require huge power source, and there are many bombers which can subsequently be converted into electronic warfare role. The bomber could be converted into a refueler and things like that. And let us look at quickly the disadvantages. A bigger aircraft, bigger target, a costlier aircraft. Stealth to be achieved in a bomber will be so much more difficult. And many of the roles that once bombers used to do have been taken over by fighters and that's why many of the fighters are called fighter bombers. And these aircraft also have their own self-protection, electronic warfare. So with these advantages and disadvantages, why India? So first thing in India is that we are short of even fighter aircraft. We are down to 30 squadrons. First, we have to fill up the fighter numbers. Second, what is our continental role right now? We are not yet a global power. Our requirement is from Gulf of Hormuz to Malacca, and these 2 roles can currently be met by the Su-30 and the Rafale with the FRA available. So therefore, these fighters can also carry cruise missiles. So therefore, at this instant, the priority for Indian Air Force, as I said in some of my writings, is to get our fighter numbers up and use these fighters with extended range with FRAs. Maybe later, but one day if we have to be a global power, and subsequently we have to really dominate the whole of Indian Ocean right down, the middle and to the southern parts, then we will require bombers, and that my feeling is in timelines of around 20 years from now. Yes.
Okay, so you're saying not now, but maybe 20 years from now. Angad, where do these questions keep cropping up from? The last time we saw media reports talking about bombers, there were some saying India is looking at the, the Blackjack bomber from the Russia. Was the time when those satellite pictures during the Ladakh standoff emerged of, Chinese bombers at certain bases in Xinjiang and Tibet, etc. Where does this come from? Has the Indian Air Force ever been seriously looking at acquiring this kind of thing?
Look, I've never been privy to any plans of the Air Forces that involve. Right. So like I was saying, I've never been privy to any plans of the Indian Air Force that have talked about acquiring bombers, and I think at least part of the rationale for it could just be, certainly educated kite flying by certain analysts and commentators. And as to why the Blackjack is mentioned, it's pretty simple. It's because it's the only bomber accessible to the Indian Air Force that one can buy off the shelf. There are no live exportable production lines open to India at the moment. We can't buy US bombers because they're not cleared for export, and we obviously aren't going to buy Chinese bombers, which leaves only Russian strategic bombers as a plausible option for the Indian Air Force. Moving on to the why and whether we should, I have to agree with Air Marshal Chopra. This is definitely not a conversation for the present day. Given the not just the lack of investment that's gone into air power in recent years, but it's more to do with holistically building up military capability. and prioritizing funding, not just to air power, but across all three services. And the challenges there are enormous. And frankly, it doesn't bear thinking about that these existing challenges should now be muddied by talk of acquiring strategic bombers. It's also, I think, beyond the time issue. I think what the Air Marshal was alluding to was the issue of affordability, centrally speaking, beyond tactics and strategy. But even if bombers are affordable, when India is at 5 trillion, 6 trillion, 10 trillion, many years down the line,
Yeah.
it's also to do with the political will and the political directive to the armed forces. If the armed forces, even of a $10 trillion GDP India, if the armed forces are still mandated to safeguard the sovereignty of India, and India does not lay claim to any overseas interests or conflict zones, then even then bombers are a moot question then, because anything you need to do within the present political mandate or something similar to it down the line doesn't require strategic bombers at all.
Okay.